Utilities planned for profit. We are doing a webinar series this fall called What is Driving Up My Energy Costs? How the retreat from clean energy is costing us all more and what you can do about it. So we started this series with a webinar on the expiring tax incentives for clean energy and also what you can take advantage of for your homes. We did that a couple weeks ago, and today we're talking about utilities and what happens as they make plans to build infrastructure. And next Thursday, or Thursday, November 6th, we'll be talking about data centers and what happens when they come to communities. Today, I'm really glad to be joined here by Brian Edstrom, who is a senior regulatory advocate with the Citizens Utility Board. My name is Sarah Wolf, and I'm the Strategic Policy Director here at Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. We're going to get right into it. I have a presentation Brian does, and then we're really looking forward to having a Q&A session with you. There is a central understanding that is the aim of the webinar today, and it's one that I didn't think about until a few years ago, but one that helped me make sense of how and why utilities do what they do. And that is that utilities make money when they build infrastructure. New energy facilities, whether it is a coal or natural gas plant, wind or solar facilities or battery storage, transmission lines, substations, wires and poles, they are guaranteed a right to earn a reasonable return on the infrastructure they build, typically in the range of 9 to 10%, as determined by the Public Utilities Commission and paid for by you, the ratepayer. So the more they build, the more likely they are to make and profit, and the more your energy prices are likely to go up. The rates that you pay cover the cost of many other expenses the utility incurs, the fuel, maintenance and operations, executive pay, even the scores of lobbyists they employ at the legislature. But the return on equity, or ROE, which allows them to earn a return on their investments, is on the infrastructure that they build. And this return is important to those companies because as publicly traded companies, investor-owned utilities are responsible to their shareholders. And indeed, they have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize returns for their shareholders. And so just a little bit of background about where this guaranteed right to earn a return comes from. A couple features of our system create this guarantee. And first, it is grounded in the US Constitution's Takings Clause. The 5th and 14th Amendments protect against the government taking private property without just compensation. And so a state utilities commission could violate the Takings Clause if it prevents a utility company from earning a reasonable return on the company's investments in private property that are used to provide utility services. It also comes from this monopoly franchise that the utility has as your electricity or natural gas provider. When most of our utility systems were being built across the last century, the only reasonably efficient way to provide service to a home was through one set of wires that connected all of the homes in the area. And another company installing another set of wires to provide the same service didn't make sense economically. And so monopolies were granted for the utility providing service to an area. And in exchange for that monopoly, the utility agrees to be regulated, in our case in Minnesota, by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, which has the final say on rates and numerous other details regarding utility service. And then the guarantee of this reasonable rate of return also comes from the PUC, which, as we just said, establishes the rates the utility may charge ratepayers. And we'll hear a good deal more on this in a bit from Brian Edstrom. Now, this system of being guaranteed a rate of return on what they build is not inherently bad. In fact, for many decades, it was a system that served to build out the electrification and utility structures from which we benefit every day. And we've done that effectively, efficiently, done that across the country. But today, our needs have evolved, and it's really essential that we look at this model and incentive structure and ask, what choices does it encourage? And are those choices in the public interest? So if we're asking ourselves, what does this model encourage? It encourages the building of new infrastructure, replacing existing systems, building systems that will need replacing. There are some things that it doesn't necessarily encourage either, and that's maximizing the efficient use of electricity or of heat, the efficient use of transmission lines, using capacity you already have access to on the grid or rooftops, waste heat, etc., avoiding delays or cost overruns, choosing the least expensive option. If there is a surge in demand, the answer under this business model is build more supply. And it is especially profitable if you can build what you need a distance from where it will be used, because then you will need transmission to move the power around. And that has the potential to make shareholders even more money. So as a climate strategist here with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, there is another concept I'd like to insert here, and that is the concept of the dead end pathway. What is a dead end pathway? It is a path that may look attractive compared to the status quo, but one that will not be able to get us to our final destination. Dead end pathways are using technologies that build us to some midpoint, maybe a benchmark that we need to get to, but then requires us to build again, to invest again in a new path. So when we hear utilities say that we need to build natural gas in order to be a bridge to renewable energy, what we should hear them saying also is that we'd like to build that utility would like to build rounds of infrastructure so that they can maximize their profits, maximize their rates of return at the expense of ratepayers. And we could go straight to solar and battery storage. Let's see if we should first build a new natural gas plant. Minnesota Power, which was just granted the right by the Public Utilities Commission to be acquired by private equity firms, including BlackRock, has said that it has needed access to money for the clean energy transition. But if you look at their IRP, which is their planning over a 5-year period for how they will plan to meet the demand for power in their area, their plans in that IRP outpace renewable generation and include a gigawatt of new natural gas. And I think it's important that we look at these plans and understand the way this model of rate of return for infrastructure might play into the planning processes of the utilities that we interact with. Until we as a society incentivize what we actually want, our goals and progress will be stymied by utility systems that are able to profit when they build more and charge us more in the process. So what do we really want? Well, I submit that what we really want isn't necessarily electricity or naturally gas, but it's the outcomes that those provide. We want our devices to work. We want our refrigerator to keep our food cold. We want comfort in our homes. We want clean, healthy air inside and out. We want safety. We want reliability. And we want this to be available for the lowest prices possible. There are ways to accomplish all of this and more. We have the technology we need to dramatically reduce the electricity we use and keep the outcomes we want. We have what we need to remove natural gas from our lives while keeping the outcomes that we want. But it's important that we understand that doing those things is in conflict with the way our system incentivizes the building of more and the selling of more. And so here I'm planting a seed for future webinars where we talk about this concept of how we change these incentives. But for today, we will need to understand the system as it exists so we can do two things. And that is hold the utilities and the commission that regulates them accountable for the rates that they are setting for ratepayers. And the second thing is that we need to be able to speak back to the recent talking points being promoted by utilities or fossil fuel industry and their allies that energy costs are going up because of the transition to clean energy. We need to be able to see through and evaluate those claims, reject them where it's appropriate, push back on those who are promoting them. And I'll just finally add that we know, this is something just worth repeating, that renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy. And on an unsubsidized dollar per megawatt basis, renewable energy remains the most cost competitive form of generation. I'm going to now turn it over to Brian Edstrom, who is a senior regulatory advocate with the Citizens Utility Board, and who's going to talk about more details around this and also the Xcel Rate Case that is ongoing right now and open for public comment. Thank you, Brian.
Right. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm going to try to share my screen here. So thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to join. And I recognize some of the names on the call, but not all of you. So perhaps not all of you are aware of CUB or the Citizens Utility Board, but just to introduce who we are real quick, we're a nonprofit based here in Minnesota that is primarily focused on advocating for residential ratepayers in energy and utility related proceedings, and also providing outreach and communication directly to energy consumers to help them better understand how to more efficiently and economically use their utility services and save money on their utility bills. So I'm an attorney. I'm part of CUB's policy and advocacy team and do a lot of work in front of the Public Utilities Commission. We also have folks here, as I mentioned, that do a lot of outreach and participate in events around the state and reach out directly to consumers to help them better understand their utility bills. So I'll be kind of picking up and adding to what Sarah said a little bit on that return on investment that is a way that utilities make money, and part of the way that rates have been going up in recent years. And I want to stress for a minute something that Sarah said, that the fact that utilities earn a return and are allowed a return is not all a bad thing. We want our utilities to be healthy and to be viable in order to provide the service that we all rely on. And we want there to be an incentive for them to maintain infrastructure and invest in upgrades that are needed, and invest in a transition to renewable energy that we believe and more research shows will be the better cost-effective alternative in the future. So the fact that there is some profit motivation is not inherently a bad thing. It's just all about balancing that profit motivation with looking out for ratepayer interests and keeping rates affordable as well. And that's the tricky part. So that's part of what we do when we get involved in rate cases. But one thing, as Sarah mentioned, that the law allows is a right to a reasonable return on investments that utilities make in infrastructure. And though it's more complicated than this, you can kind of think about it like interest on a mortgage. But how it works in practice is when a utility files a rate case, which I'll get into in more detail, they have to justify the revenue deficiency that they're facing in order to provide electric service or natural gas service and how they meet that deficiency by charging their customers the rates that they do. And the way the law works is they can bake into that revenue deficiency an authorized return that the commission sets, the Public Utilities Commission sets. So that's like an actual quantified number that becomes part of their revenue deficiency used to calculate rates. So the higher that authorized return is that's set by the commission, the higher rates will be. I got a little out of order here that I was just saying that it's not all a bad thing. It's all about finding the right balance. And how all this happens is through what's called a rate case, which is a really complicated legal proceeding that I got into this work 5 years ago. I've been a lawyer for a while, but I really had no idea how complicated this is and how the sausage is made, so to speak, in terms of setting rates for a regulated utility. But it's a very long process that's grounded in Minnesota law that at root requires utility rates to be just and reasonable, with doubt as to reasonableness resolved in favor of the consumer. That's kind of the grounding principle that is established for utility rates in our state law. And the utility that is requesting a rate increase has the burden to prove that their rates are just and reasonable for ratepayers. And in order to meet that burden of proof, they have to show that the expenses that they incur, that they want to recover through rates, are prudently incurred, and prudence is kind of a legal standard that comes up in rate cases, and that they're necessary to provide safe and reliable service. And then, as I mentioned, they're allowed to earn that reasonable return. And the process for going through a rate case is itself procedurally fairly complex. Often a proposal to a proposal to increase rates is typically filed in the fall. So, for example, Xcel just filed their latest electric rate case last November. And then the commission typically will suspend the final rate increase while they go through a long regulatory process to evaluate the proposal. And that evaluation typically occurs before an administrative law judge at the Office of Administrative Hearings, so a separate state agency. And it's essentially a legal process, not unlike a civil litigation, but not quite as formal as that. But the parties will present witnesses who file testimony and introduce evidence. There's an evidentiary hearing where lawyers will cross-examine other parties' witnesses. There are public hearings where people from the public can literally get behind a mic and speak directly to the judge about their concerns. And then eventually the lawyers for the parties will file legal briefs laying out their arguments. And the judge overseeing that whole process will produce a report that summarizes the evidence that she has gathered over that legal process and produces a recommendation as to what the Public Utilities Commission should do with the requested rate increase. And that recommendation is not binding. It's not a binding judicial opinion. It's literally a recommendation based on the record evidence that the judge has evaluated. And the commission then has the final say as to setting final rates. And they make a decision by a majority vote. There are 5 commissioners. And ultimately, after all of that whole process is complete, which usually takes more than a year, the commission will hold a hearing and set final rates. During that time, because that process takes so long, Minnesota law allows utilities to set what are called interim rates. So some portion of their proposed final rate increase is permitted just as a matter of law. It just automatically goes into effect unless there are unusual circumstances. So, for example, if those of you who are Xcel customers last January saw your bills go up due to an interim rate increase because of that rate case that was filed the previous November. If the final rates are set such that the final rates are lower than the interim rates, then customers will be refunded the difference. If the final rates are higher than the interim rates, then the utility cannot recover, they cannot surcharge customers for that full under collection. They can only recover the difference between final rates and interim rates for the period after the commission issues its order. It's kind of confusing, but that's how it works. It's a very complicated process. And as part of that process, one of the most contested and kind of important issues that comes up in a rate case is the authorized return on equity, which is basically kind of the key figure that goes into how the commission sets a utility's authorized return. And it's important because that can it typically accounts for around 10% of the overall revenue requirement that the utility is claiming supports their purported need for a rate increase. So that's a lot. I mean, and that 10% is really, it's just the return. It's just costs that ratepayers pay through their rates that will ultimately go towards profits that support shareholders' return at the utilities. So again, some return is warranted and reasonable and protected by law. The utilities are literally entitled to some reasonable return, but they're not entitled to an excessive return. So it's been our position, and I think a growing number of consumer advocates' position, that over time, ROEs across the country and in Minnesota have become inflated. And commissions, not just here, but in many states, have allowed utilities to earn a higher ROE than is really reasonable. And that means rates are higher than they need to be, and utilities are making more money than they need to be to provide safe and reliable service. And that really that tips that balance and upsets that if there's a reasonable doubt, it doesn't resolve it in favor of the consumer, right? So that's a big part of what we're fighting against and other parties are fighting against in rate cases. So I won't get into the details too much on this, but if you're interested in studying ROE, there are a few kind of key Supreme Court cases that are kind of form the backbone precedent for how do we determine what a reasonable return is. And the Hope and Bluefield decisions, the first and third one there on the list, are the cases that are most commonly cited in rate cases. And there's some key language that always is cited in every single rate case. This is a simplified version here, but a utility, the Supreme Court has said that a utility has the right to earn a return that allows it to attract capital, maintain financial integrity and creditworthiness, and compete with peer companies of similar risk. So that's kind of the benchmark, the floor of what establishes what it means to be a reasonable return. On the other hand, the Hope decision also sets forth, that a reasonable return has to balance and look out for consumer interests as well. So, the Hope decision, even though it's cited by utilities as supporting their and justifying their right to a reasonable return, the court in that case actually upheld a utility regulator's decision to really significantly restrict a utility's return and cut their profits in that case. So it's a quite interesting old case that we argue about a lot in rate cases. I just wanted to throw that in here as an important one. Another interesting detail about ROEs is in every single rate case in Minnesota, and I presume in other states as well, the utility will hire an expert witness that is a finance expert that will file testimony using financial models to justify their requested ROE. And they almost always request an ROE that is over 10%. Not even almost. Every single rate case I've seen, they always request an ROE over 10%. And they, produce really complicated testimony that's really hard to understand if you don't have a background in finance and specifically utility finance and regulation. But the commission never awards them that full request. Typically the commission awards ROEs in the mid to lower 9% range. But again, even that we think is really higher than what is justified. And I think a frustration that I've had as a consumer advocate is that it seems that by continuing to file rate cases with this initial proposal and request of really high inflated ROEs, it sort of artificially sets the upper end of the spectrum of what a reasonable ROE looks like too high. It creates a artificially high benchmark that I think makes it uncomfortable for commissions to cut that too low because they worry that if they prevent the utility from earning a reasonable return, they could get sued and accused of violating that constitutional protection to earn just compensation for their investments in property. So it's I don't know but it's a as we've gotten more familiar with this topic, and we also have worked with a finance expert that we hire as an expert witness who has 40 years of experience doing this stuff, I think we've gotten better at articulating our arguments and pushing back on the utility experts' arguments to hopefully inform and sort of help slowly turn that ship of how commissions look at ROEs and feel more comfortable that if they establish a lower ROE, that will help ratepayers by lowering rates and will not unreasonably harm utilities or their shareholders or prevent them from earning a reasonable return. So just to use Xcel's latest rate case as an example, their rates have been going up quite a bit recently, as a lot of utilities have, but they've filed a few multi-year rate cases in the last few years. I think due to those multiple filings, they've had a rate increase, including 2025 and 2026. In each of the last 5 years, they will have had a rate increase. Their current rate increase proposes about a 9.6% increase in 2025, and then a 3.6% increase beyond that, so up and above that 9% increase in 2026. And some of that is probably needed and justified in order to make some of the investments that are needed to keep up with rising demand for electricity, to fund new infrastructure and transmission and things like that. So they will have to meet their burden of proof to show that it's reasonable, but not all of that is unreasonable. It's just it's hard for ratepayers to swallow when there's been so many rate increases. But one thing that you don't see in sort of their public talking points is their request to raise their ROE quite a bit. And their current ROE is 9.25%. They're requesting to raise it to 10.3%. That might not sound like much, but our expert initially estimated that alone would account for, if the commission approved that, which they won't, but if they approve that 10.3%, that alone would amount to like $140 million per year of additional revenue that Xcel would need to collect in their rates. So that's a huge percentage of their rate increase. And they claim that they need that additional revenue to attract capital and maintain financial integrity and compete with their peers. But we just really think that that's an inflated number. And we instead have proposed that they could actually have a lower ROE and still do all those things, and it would be better for ratepayers. Because, as many of you probably know, ratepayers are struggling right now. There's still a lot of people are struggling with inflation. Some of the loss of federal funding and programs is really harming people right now. The shutdown is currently causing LIHEAP and other low-income programs to be disrupted. So, in order to balance the interests of ratepayers and utility shareholders, there really needs to be an accounting for these struggles that ratepayers are facing right now. And on the other hand, Xcel's been doing pretty well. Their profits have been rising over the past several years. This is Xcel Energy Inc., so sort of the mothership, the whole company that includes regulated utilities operating in other states as well. But that's not, even just looking at Xcel's Minnesota utility, they've been doing well as well. This graph shows the earnings per share, so like the earnings per share of Xcel Energy stock attributed just to revenue earned from its Minnesota utility operations. And that too has been on the rise. So from our perspective, we think that it would be appropriate for the commission to protect ratepayers by lowering their authorized return in order to help mitigate the rate increase and not continue to allow Xcel to continue on this trajectory of growing profits. So these are the parties, most of the parties, not all of them, involved in the current current Xcel rate case. The Minnesota Department of Commerce and the Attorney General's office are two state agencies that are always involved in rate cases that try to hold utilities accountable to ensure they meet their burden of proof for charging just and reasonable rates. We have been increasingly involved in rate cases. We're not in every one of them, but we are to the extent our resources allow. The Xcel Large Industrials is a consortium of large industrial customers. They also are fighting against rate of return issues. They have an expert that is advocating for a lower ROE because that affects them too. Industrial rates are also significantly impacted by a higher return. And Energy Sense Coalition is a low-income advocate that looks out for low-income consumers. And then these joint interveners, which include Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light and others, that are advocating for both some consumer and environmental issues in the rate case. So another really cool thing about this rate case is there's been a ton of public participation in it. I think by our last count, there have been 7,000 public comments filed in this rate case. That's far more than any I've ever seen in any PUC docket. And I think when people get engaged and involved in proceedings before the PUC, it really does send a message. And the parties like us that are involved and the commissioners themselves take note of that. So if you're interested in getting more involved and making your voice heard, I really encourage you to do that. There's some great resources on the PUC's website itself to learn more about the open dockets and the Xcel rate case specifically, and other rate cases and other dockets that are open. There's also this third bullet point, a really great webpage that provides some tips and just practical directions for how to submit a public comment. I think that's really helpful. And we have some resources on our website as well. CUB has a whole page on our website just kind of devoted to the Xcel rate case. We regularly publish articles on our website that just kind of keeps track of what we're up to. So if you ever are curious what we're doing or are interested in learning more about our work, I encourage you to visit our webpage and reach out. So I think, did we actually leave enough time for questions this time? We did. So I think I'll stop there and kind of open the floor. I see there's questions in the chat, but I haven't really been following along. So
I have, Brian. May I just throw them out to you?
yeah.
The first one is just to distinguish between the investor-owned utilities and the rural electric co-ops and municipal energy organizations. Would you speak to that?
Yeah, great question. So, yes, there are different types of utilities, and investor-owned utilities are really what I'm mostly talking about in this presentation. Those are the ones that are regulated in exchange for having a state-granted monopoly, essentially. So they are subject to the strictest regulation and oversight by state commissions and by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. Municipal utilities are run by municipalities. So, that's a kind of a different animal. And then cooperatives are managed by their members. So they're not regulated nearly as stringently or not at all in the same way as a investor-owned utility is. Although under Minnesota law, they can choose to be. So um, I don't know. That's kind of neither here nor there. But mainly what I'm talking about here is investor-owned utilities, which is the larger Xcel, Minnesota Power, CenterPoint, Otter Tail, um, Merck, the bigger ones.
Thanks. The next question was, is there a difference in rate of return for the various types of infrastructure, for instance, natural gas versus solar or wind power?
Also a great question. Yeah, that yes, and it's interesting. I don't really know. I don't have a great understanding why, but there is. So Xcel has both electric and gas service, but when they have separate rate cases for their gas and electric rates, so they can and do have separate authorized ROEs for their gas service and their electric service. They're treated separately. So they currently have a higher authorized ROE for their gas service than their electric service. And I think that's in part, well, I do know why it's higher, why it's sort of set up that way, where the same company that is a dual fuel utility has separate ROEs. It's a little confusing and murky to me, but I think investments in gas infrastructure is a little more risky for some of the reasons Sarah was talking about. There's a less certain future for gas utilities right now as more people electrify and move towards, solar and wind and things like that and away from natural gas. So gas utilities sometimes have a higher ROE to account for that risk because they might need that to attract capital and compete with, electric utilities, for example, to attract capital from some of the same investors.
If I may interrupt and ask a follow-on question from exactly that. Another way to ask that question is there a difference in the rate of return for natural gas power plants producing electricity and those that are solar and wind? So not between the two different branches of the service, but of
Yeah,
the electric generating infrastructure.
I see. That I don't think so. So if there's yeah, in Xcel's rate case, if Xcel has, infrastructure that generates electricity using gas versus using solar, they would have the same rate of return that would apply to either. How much that's sort of like the authorized rate of return, how much of an actual return they generate on either plant or either set of if infrastructure might differ because the costs of like the margins on operating that equipment might be different, but the authorized rate of return set by the commission would be the same.
Great question. Someone asks, how is the ROE different than the usual ROI, return on investment?
Oh man, some of those questions I wish I could answer, but I feel like um, I'm not the best person to answer that. There's our expert is a guy named Steve Keim, and he's like a wizard at answering questions like that. But it gets really complicated getting into some of those financial terms because there's rate of return, there's return on equity, cost of equity, return on investment, and I think if there was some big Venn diagram of overlapping circles with all of those terms involved, I wouldn't quite be able to explain all the differences. But the other thing is there's authorized ROE, and then there's like the actual return on investment that's more. So the authorized ROE is the number that the commission sets. So you can almost think of that as like well, that's the number that they set to quantify a return and pre-bake that into rates. It's a number they use for rate making purposes, but saying that the commission allows a 9 to 10% authorized ROE is not the same as saying we guarantee the utility will make a 9 to 10% profit. It just means they use that 9 to 10% ROE to calculate about what that return would look like in dollars, and then to add that to the revenue requirement that the utility is approved to recover through rates. But what they actually make, so what the shareholder actually makes as a return on investment, it, will involve, a typical what the business's expenses are versus their revenue, and, balancing costs and expense, or revenue versus expenses, and a more typical accounting and finance exercise.
One of the questions is, are environmental risks included in these calculations?
Environment, maybe could whoever asked that maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Mark? I don't know if Mark is available to elaborate, but what Mark put in was that, isn't it interesting that the environmental risks don't seem to be included here in these calculations, or maybe we haven't discussed the nuances of that now. I don't know that I'm going to fully answer your question, Mark, but one of the infrastructure investments that Xcel is proposing in this current rate case has to do with wildfire mitigation.
Yeah.
Which I think we're all, most of us would agree, considering wildfire mitigation is extremely important analysis to do. And still to also ask the right kinds of questions about the types of investments that they're proposing to make around that. I think that question and concept of, are we asking the right questions about environmental risks? Are we putting the externalities that we know we're going to experience from various choices into financial calculations is always one that's worth significant analysis.
Yeah. Okay. I think I understand the question, and I think the short answer is probably no. That generally speaking, so yeah, say if a utility is pushing back on transitioning to renewable energy, does the risk of not doing so cause them to have a lower ROE? Not necessarily, but that's an interesting question that bleeds into a kind of a whole nother big subject area of sort of performance-based rate making, some of you might have heard of. So in theory, a commission could incentivize a regulated utility to invest in renewables by increasing their ROE, in exchange for them doing that, or lowering it, kind of using ROE as a carrot or a stick. I think that's kind of a slippery slope, because I think once a commission starts doing that, if a utility is able to kind of meet that standard as minimally as possible, just enough to get past it and earn that higher ROE, is it really accomplishing as much as what people hope it is? And I think that can be kind of difficult to measure, but it's an interesting question, and it's one that comes up in the context of performance-based rate making.
Great. There's a question here about, what is the usual difference between the administrative law judge recommendation and the PUC rate hike. Have you seen any
Yeah,
changes there?
that's another great question. It can vary a lot. Sarah mentioned the Elite acquisition that was approved. The acquisition of Minnesota Power was approved recently. I was very heavily involved in that case. The administrative law judge issued a report that was very critical of the acquisition and pretty strongly recommended that it be denied. And then the commission unanimously approved it. So, totally opposite result. So that was probably a kind of extreme example, but it's also rare. In a rate case, it's, I would say, rare for the commission to totally align with the ALJ report. There's usually some variances, but I don't know. In the last electric rate case, the last Xcel electric rate case, trying to remember, I think the ALJ might have recommended that Xcel be permitted like a 9.67% ROE or something, and the commission came in and approved a 9.25% ROE. So quite a bit lower than what the ALJ recommended, and which was good from our perspective. It was much closer to what we had recommended. So but it can vary quite a bit.
Great. There are a couple questions about data centers and how that interplays with the rates of electricity. And
Yeah.
I know this is a topic where our next webinar is going to be on data centers and this interplay. I'll just turn this over to you, Brian, and we can go back and forth if you like.
Yeah, well, if I could phone a friend, if James, my colleague at Cub, is still on, and James, if you could put Brandon's article in the chat. Our colleague at Cub we just published an article that Brandon wrote about data centers, and some legislative efforts around that that I think will be helpful. And it's a well-written and I think pretty informative article. But yeah, there's data centers is a huge topic and huge concern right now. And one of the concerns is they consume and demand so much electricity that and it's happening so quickly that utilities might be compelled to build new generation just to serve that data center. And then who pays for that? Normally, if a utility needs to build a new power plant, the cost of operating that and the electricity it produces is socialized across all of the utilities customers. But if the new demand for a data center, which can be as much as a whole town, if that is what is driving the need to build a new power plant, we would like to see the data center pay for those costs and not, say residential customers. So there's been legislation introduced here and elsewhere that is trying to solve that problem, in part by creating a new rate class for data centers for very large industrial customers. So essentially, creating a new rate class creates an avenue for the commission to assign the costs of certain infrastructure just to one rate class. And that's still kind of an evolving process, but it's a super important discussion right now that's happening all over the country. So it's a great question.
Yeah, and the legislation that passed around data centers last year, many of the legislators would tell you that that was a start, but it did include a piece that asks our Public Utilities Commission to look at developing that rate class that Brian was just mentioning. Great. There's more questions. Do we know what the percentage of Xcel's rate increase would be directly attributable? What percentage of Xcel's rate increase would be directly attributable to their higher ROE request?
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but typically it's right around 10% is kind of an average. It may be a little more or less there, but that there are so many different categories of things that go into a rate increase. So 10% on its own doesn't really sound like a lot, but it is. That's like and considering that's essentially, you know, money that comes straight out of ratepayers' pockets and, you know, essentially is just supporting shareholder returns. So it's not covering costs of, you know, making the lights go on directly. You know, that's my perspective on it. A person working for a utility would explain it in a different way, and it is a little more complicated than that. But it's not the same as just saying that, you know, the cost of maintaining a power plant is X, and cutting those costs means, you know, you risk not maintaining it as safely as possible. Rather, reducing the costs of supporting an ROE just means rates will go down a little bit and shareholders' profits might go down a little bit. And well, yeah.
So here's one. Next. This commenter said, I've heard experts say that the rate of return for a utility based on their actual risk should be closer to 6% rather than 9 to 10%. That's typically awarded, which is basically the stock market's average return, is that 6% figure. Operating a monopoly, which gets a guaranteed return, is presumably less risky than the stock market. So why do utilities often get this 9 to 10%?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Was that Hudson? Who's somebody I saw?
That's Curtis on.
Oh, Curtis. Nice one, Curtis. Yeah. So that gets back to the difference between what's called cost of equity versus return on equity. And this is a key concept that comes up in the testimony of our expert and some other consumer advocate experts that have gotten more active in this space. And Curtis is absolutely right. So the cost of equity is really what investors require, the return that investors require to invest in a company. So it's very complicated to try to explain in more detail, but essentially think of it as if you're just looking at a basic analysis of different stocks to buy, and you're considering investing in Xcel and looking at the risks of whether you lose money or not. Whatever percentage is where you feel fairly certain you'll make that percentage back, what's the threshold that will get you to tip you over the edge to put in your money? And that's the cost of equity. And that is much lower than what return on equity has been. And as Curtis mentioned, that is more in like the 7% range. So our expert has been saying really what the commission should be doing in a rate case is using models and sort of more objective financial analysis to determine what the cost of equity is, and then figure out how to set an authorized return on equity somewhere above that, depending on how well the utility is doing versus and how well the ratepayers are doing, and that's where some of those more subjective elements, like if they're doing well to transition to renewable in line with state policy or things like that, could be a higher ROE could reward them for those efforts, or a lower ROE could sort of punish them for poor customer service or things like that. And adjustments to ROE could better account for affordability issues like we're experiencing right now, where people are really struggling with rising electric costs. And that is too where I think, going back to one of my earlier slides, I think more experts are starting to think and argue that authorized ROEs have drifted increasingly farther and farther away from the actual cost of equity and gotten higher and higher away from that in a way that doesn't really make sense. And it's not really supported by finance principles. And what it really means is it just allows for shareholders to earn more than they really require at ratepayers' expense. So that it's a really important concept that is a big part of our arguments in these rate cases.
Well, I think I'm going to close it here. There are more questions. Some of them are in the vein of what it looks like outside of the investor-owned utility system. And I'm going to collect some information and put that in the resources that we send out in the next couple of days as a follow-up to this webinar. And the other comment that I really appreciated, there were several comments on the data centers and what our views are on the tariffs that might be asked of them. And then one I want to highlight too was about the way that buildings, our homes, businesses, all of our buildings could be seen as part of the grid, and that efficiency in those homes and buildings creates capacity and creates the ability to supply other things. And features a Rewiring America report that recently came out that speaks to the way efficiencies could give data centers the power they need. So I want to just to say that that is going to be one of the topics of our data center webinar on November 6th. So we're going to explore that in much more detail then. I really appreciate all of you coming and your questions here. Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your time with us. And we will send out resources. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you all.